Hi, and welcome to today's online training session. My name is Charles, and I'll be your online instructor today. For this session, we're going to be discussing the SpecDD process model. Now, this is the overall process model pertaining to SpecDD, and it will cover everything from the beginning, the requirements, drawing them up, creating them, modifying them, to how the sprint proceeds, the processes that are done within the sprint, within each iteration, what that produces, the deliverables, how that ties into the testing, the quality control, as well as back all the way to the beginning for the requirements. So what I have here on my first slide is the overall diagram. Now, the meat, the most important section of this process model is, of course, the development cycle, the sprint, or the iteration. These are typically 2 to 4 weeks, and it's not any different than the normal sprint cycles of other agile methodology. This section is pretty much exactly the same. This is where the backlog items tie into, come in from, and it's where they're consumed to produce the working software. The Agile team, the Agile development team, of course, are the main driving force behind the creation of this working software. The Agile team is a fully capable, self-driving team. Consists of the programmers, the developers, of course. Also consists of jointly integrated QA testers, what we refer to in SpecDD as the QA floaters, and even the designers, the graphics or interface UI designers, are also part of this complete Agile team. Expanding out from just this cycle, we see the inputs and the outputs. So we, of course, have the sprint backlog, the product backlog as the inputs, and then the output, the deliverable, is the working software. However, one key difference, and this is where we start differentiating SpecDD from other Agile Scrum methodologies, are how the inputs and the outputs are connected to the requirements and to testing. So everything comes from requirements. This is really the origin. This is the alpha. Everything starts out from here, and the requirements drive the population of the product backlog and the sprint backlog. In other Agile methodologies, the requirements are used in the backlog, and they're consumed in the sprint. In SpecDD, however, we create abstracts from these requirements. The original requirement is maintained and kept in its requirement space. And from that requirement, we create an abstract, an artifact, an object that is consumed through the sprint to create the working software. The purpose of this is this arrow you see coming out of the working software back to the requirements. The Agile team, they are not only responsible for creating this working software, for designing it, for programming, developing it, even for QA floaters testing it. Another deliverable, just as important as the working software, is updating the requirements, modifying them, changing them, keeping track of the changes that were done to the requirements. And the reason for this is because SpecDD allows for change very quickly. You can change the requirement, you can change what is being designed even within a sprint. However, you must update the original requirements to reflect those changes. And that is the second deliverable within SpecDD. So again, the first is of course the working software. But from the working software, we know we may be introduced to new ideas, we may have new logic, we may have discovered something that requires us to change the original requirement. And so the second deliverable are the updates, the modifications to these requirements. And this has to be done by the Agile team. Just getting the productivity to create this working software isn't enough. Okay? Just producing it, it is of course extremely important, but it's not the sole responsibility of the Agile teams. SpecDD, we also want to improve a team's innovation ability. We also want to improve their business intelligence. And they gain this knowledge through SpecDD's cycle iterations of sprints to working softwares to updating their original requirements to reflect the business logic or the discoveries that they've found while creating the working software. And this is a key difference that distinguishes SpecDD. Very similar to Scrum while we're inside this inner circle, but as we expand out, we have not only the requirement piece that's added, but also the quality piece. Now for the quality piece, please focus on the outskirts of this diagram. So again, we start at the requirements. Okay, we have our original requirement. That leads directly to the test library. What does that mean in real-world application? The requirement comes in from the stakeholder, modified by the product owner to really understand it. It gets sent to QA to create test cases directly from the original intent of this requirement. The test library is then built up with all these test cases that will specifically test the original requirements. There have been no stops, no interruptions in between these 2 points. Okay, from point A straight to quality assurance point B. This really maintains the high quality testing standards that any company needs. Why test something when you don't understand or don't know the original intent, the original purpose of the item, of the function? Okay. SpecDD, we ensure that the testing is testing the important thing, which is the original requirement, which is the original intent of that function. The test library then helps create this release test plan for this particular iteration. And from that, you have your test cycle. Okay, your QA team, completely independent. This QA team, this is not the QA floaters. These are not the QA floaters that I mentioned before. This is a separate independent team testing the original requirements within this test cycle. And that is your little QA circular here. Now from this QA testing the working software for this particular test cycle, they will inevitably find defects, as denoted by this little ladybug at the bottom. And these defects do not go directly back into that sprint. They typically, they can, but they typically will also not go back into the sprint backlog right away. The optimal path for defects found is to go back into the product backlog. Why? because that is where the product owner can then review these defects, prioritize them, make the necessary changes or updates, maybe provide some additional detail as to what the bug, how to fix the bug. And then once the product owner has reviewed it and is satisfied, then he or she can pass it along through the sprint backlog to queue it up for the next sprint. So that completes this overall process model. Each section is, of course, extremely important and extremely well integrated to the other moving pieces. Now, for this to really flow smoothly, the key is something not shown here, and that is simply communication. Communication within the team, communication outside of the team, communication to the other teams. That's really something we stress in SpecDD. Next, we have the SpecDD hybrid agile model, and it's more of a textual representation, whereas the previous one was more graphical. So, once again, I'm going to start with the kind of the center, the bulk of the work. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important, but you'll notice these two blue sections, the development space and the product backlog. This is also the sections that are most similar, again, to Scrum and to other agile development methodologies. Okay. We have our development space with our multiple sprints. So you have your sprints here running about 2 weeks, it seems. And then with each sprint, you of course have your stories and your tasks. Now, a subtle difference, you'll notice that our story labels here are story 1-1 and story 1-2. This ties into the SpecDD distinction that, again, we are not taking the original requirement. We are taking an abstract of the original requirement. So our requirement, broken down into two specs within this green space, you'll see this green arrow links it directly to the development space. It may be the same spec that 2 or 3 developers need to work on. It may be the same spec that needs to be designed and developed for multiple platforms. Okay? For instance, if we have a spec that needs something to be designed on iOS, a mobile platform, and then another developer is working on the same requirement, the same spec for Android, then we have a story 1-1 for the iOS and 1-2 for Android. We can also link those same distinctions to the test library to have multiple test cases to test for the different environments or platforms or what have you. So within the development space, that was the sprint, the stories, and then, of course, the dev task, the actual development task that the developer is tasked with. Another difference is this next section, the QA test event. Now these are the items, the actionable tasks that are assigned to the QA floaters. This is different, this is separate from the QA team that mostly lives in the test library space. Okay. The QA floaters are working off of those development tasks to test on the fly and very quickly the items that the developer has created. The QA floaters help internally to test within the development space. These QA floaters, however, they do help improve the test libraries and the test cases. So you'll see the arrow coming from the test events into the test libraries. Now, that's not to say that the test cases and test libraries don't also help the development space. So the arrow here could potentially be bidirectional in some situations. But for the most part, the test library will drive the regression testing. The regression testing, this lower green box. Now these testing cycles, as you can see, clearly drawn out, it is independent of the development space. Its input is the test library, and you'll have your different testing cycles. In some cases, the testing cycles may match up with the development sprints, and in some situations they might not. It's not mandatory for the two to sync exactly within SpecDD. The lower left, the product backlog, again, is just one of the more similar items to other agile methodologies, and this is very straightforward, just like any other product backlog. You have your stories and your tasks that are created from those stories, and that is, of course, what populates each sprint within the development space. Next slide here, we have a screenshot of TechExcel's Dev Suite. And the screenshot really goes to show how these spaces, the development space in particular in this screenshot, but also the requirement space and the quality testing space, how these spaces are really displayed and utilized within our software. The development space here, you can see on the left side, everything before was conceptual, right? We drew these diagrams, we wrote out this text to convey these principles. Real life example, a real life use is displayed really well within our software. And this is how day to day you execute SpecDD. On the left side, you have your sprints. Navigational wise, simply a folder structure in a nutshell. You have your sprints, your backlogs. You can see our product defect backlog at the very bottom. Within sprint 1 here, we have our different roles for our agile team, which again consists of programmers, developers, QA floaters, and even UI designers, graphics designers. Within each person, you'll have their tasks scheduled with our built-in calendar and our weekly view. So you'll have your different actionable items, and it'll say which spec or requirement is originally stemming from. And the -1 and -2 are, of course, the multiple incarnations, if you will, multiple artifacts stemming from the same specification. You also have your time measurements within each one, time or points, depending on which, or both, depending on whatever method suits you and your team. And this really ties into our burn down reporting, our velocity reporting, but again, it's just another data point that helps the team really work effectively and produce that working software and update those requirements if changes were made to create those two deliverables that SpecDD has for each sprint. The QA floaters could also potentially have their QA floating testing subtasks listed out here, since they are part of this agile team. The full-on QA testing team will work in a separate section, in a separate space, since they are a more independent team. So that is something in a different area. The details for each team member's committed stories and tasks are displayed here. You can drill down further to see what exactly it is that they are all responsible for. And of course, time spent, time remaining, as I mentioned before, are the items that are kept track of here. Okay, for each and every developer and QA floater and designer part of the Agile team. Now, we want to do a little activity here. Topic and presentations. Okay, so our topics, we want to make sure that everybody here understands what it is that we've covered so far. And we want to do a little short presentation. Don't worry, nothing needs to be extremely fancy. But the general idea is we want you to be able to illustrate a group of epics to specs to defects. We want to make sure that you understand this overall process. So if you could, as part of the presentation, illustrate why a spec may require multiple stories to implement. Remember the example that I gave a little bit earlier? iOS and Android, multiple platforms, something like that. If you could, please explain how to drive the implementation of a spec using stories. How do stories help us create something from that spec, something that a spec details? Also explain how to drive the multiple tasks under multiple stories. What exactly in SpecDD helps us create and do these multiple tasks? Run through an example of 2 sprints containing about a dozen or so stories. Also create the tasks with the estimates, the time estimates or the point estimates that go along with those tasks. Explain some of those specs that you need to implement, maybe across multiple sprints. And then last but not least, you have some sort of real world example, something that you've worked on or done in the past. Something that really ties in all of this information to really showcase SpecDD. That'd be great. So we'll give you a few minutes for that. Then we can come back and continue on with our next session.